Welcome to our new video. In this video, we simply discussed about back-to-back letter of credit. A back-to-back letter of credit is a letter of credit where the beneficiary of the first letter of credit becomes the applicant for the second letter of credit, and the applicant of the first letter of credit becomes the beneficiary of the second letter of credit. It is basically like a two-way letter of credit that allows the parties to both import and export goods under the same letter of credit. Here's an example of a simple back-to-back letter of credit. A buyer in the US wants to purchase goods from a seller in China. The buyer doesn't have enough money to pay for the goods up front, so they ask their bank for a letter of credit. The bank issues a letter of credit to the seller in China for the amount of the transaction. The letter of credit states that if the seller ships the goods to the buyer in the US and the buyer does unpay, then the bank will pay the seller. So the seller in China ships the goods to the buyer in the US, and the buyer takes a while to pay. The buyer may have changed their mind, or they may just be trying to get the goods for free. But whatever the reason, the buyer doesn't pay the seller. So the seller goes to their bank and tells them that the buyer hasn't paid, and that they want the bank to pay them. The bank looks at the letter of credit and sees that all the terms have been met, so they pay the seller. Now the bank turns around and tries to get the money back from the buyer, but the buyer doesn't have any money, so the bank has to eat the loss. Now let's look at an example of a back-to-back letter of credit. In this example, the buyer in the US is a manufacturer that wants to buy raw materials from a supplier in China. The manufacturer uses the raw materials to make finished goods, which they then sell to a customer in India. To finance this transaction, the manufacturer obtains a letter of credit from their bank for the purchase of the raw materials from the supplier in China. The bank in the US issues a letter of credit to the supplier in China for the amount of the transaction. The letter of credit states that if the supplier ships the raw materials to the manufacturer in the US and the manufacturer doesn't pay, then the bank will pay the supplier. The supplier in China ships the raw materials to the manufacturer in the US, and the manufacturer uses them to make finished goods. The manufacturer then ships the finished goods to their customer in India. The customer in India pays the manufacturer, who in turn pays their bank. The bank now has the money to pay the supplier in China, and everyone walks away happy. There are many uses for a back-to-back letter of credit. It can be used to finance the import of goods for further processing or assembly. It can be used to finance the export of goods that are made with imported materials. It can also be used to hedge against currency fluctuations. Let's take a look at how a back-to-back letter of credit is settled. As we saw earlier, a back-to-back letter of credit is essentially two letters of credit that are issued by the same bank. This means that when the first letter of credit is settled, the second letter of credit is automatically settled as well. When the beneficiary of the first letter of credit makes a shipment, they will present the documents to the issuing bank for payment. The issuing bank will check the documents, and if everything is in order, they will make the payment. Once the issuing bank has made the payment, they will send a copy of the documents and the payment advice to the confirming bank. The confirming bank will then make the payment to their customer, which is the applicant of the letter of credit. There are some advantages to using a back-to-back letter of credit. One advantage is that it can help to improve cash flow because the applicant doesn't have to pay for the letter of credit until the beneficiary has made a shipment. Another advantage is that it can help to reduce the risk of non-payment, because the applicant is only exposed to the creditworthiness of the beneficiary, not the issuing bank. However, there are also some disadvantages to using a back-to-back letter of credit. One disadvantage is that it can be more expensive than other types of letters of credit because the applicant has to pay fees to both the issuing bank and the confirming bank. Another disadvantage is that it can be more complex to use because there are more parties involved in the transaction. Overall, a back-to-back letter of credit is a useful tool for international trade. It can help to finance transactions, reduce the risk of non-payment, and improve cash flow. However, it is important to understand the advantages and disadvantages of using a back-to-back letter of credit before deciding whether or not to use it. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Banking and finance.